And in addition, for that part of the talk, it's more introducing some ongoing work that we're doing with a couple preliminary results. But our goal there is really to be seeking observational constraints on these complex Earth system chemistry climate models that we use to address questions of interactions between air pollution and climate, or chemistry and climate. And so I have this really somewhat detailed and busy schematic on the cover slide here. And this is from a review paper that I worked on with Vaishali Naik at GFDL and Eric Leibensberger at SUNY Plattsburgh several years ago now that was focused on connections between air pollution and climate. And when I'm saying climate, I'm thinking both about climate change but also climate variability. And so I'm not going to try to talk through. I know you can't even probably read the words on this, this schematic here. But the idea that I want to get across with this slide is that there's a lot of different processes by which air pollutants and the climate system interact with each other. And in our group, we're really interested in trying to understand as many of these processes as we can. We find them all pretty fascinating. Okay, so I'll have a little bit of introduction to each of the three sections. And so the next three slides, first we're going to acknowledge all the people who are actually doing the work. And so this, I have to apologize because I'm realizing I'm overdue for a new group photo. This is an older photo, as evidenced by the fact that we still have Olivia, Jean, and Nora in this picture, and they have all since moved on to greener pastures, including Olivia here at NCAR. And the folks that I'm showing in blue are the folks whose work I'm drawing on today. And so Dan Westervelt is an associate research scientist at Lamont who collaborates with our group. Colleen Bablitz is a rising fourth-year graduate student. And George Milley is a research assistant who works full-time with us. And Gus Correa is our system administrator and scientific programmer who kind of keeps us up and running and helps out when we get into more complex modeling situations. I have a whole string of external collaborators who I won't name by name, but basically this talk is pulling from several different projects, and so there are a lot of folks that are contributing to the work and whose data and model simulations we're using. Okay, so these next three slides are going to be your sort of keys to when I'm transitioning between parts of the talk coming up. So the first part of the talk is going to focus on how weather and climate affect air pollutants. And so what I want to step through is just some of the different, not by no means all, but some of the different processes and pathways by which climate can affect air pollution. And so the first is by changing our regional meteorology that kind of sets the stage for the chemistry and air pollution to accumulate or disperse. And so there's many more aspects to meteorology. I'm not going through all of them here. The second that I think about is sort of feedbacks to changes in that regional meteorology. And there's a few different processes here that I would like to spend a little time talking through. The first are changes in emissions. So these are emissions of air pollutants or precursors to air pollution that are strongly sensitive to meteorology and thus potentially changes in climate. And one of the neat things that I enjoy about air pollution and atmospheric chemistry is that we have a lot of different sources that we have to think about. There's both anthropogenic and natural sources. And so even our anthropogenic sources, if we're thinking about, for instance, last week in Boulder, presumably those who had air conditioning were cranking it up and running it and probably using more energy than usual. And so depending on where that power is coming from, at least in the eastern US, there's often peaker units that tend to be a little bit dirtier because they're only turned on when we need them. But those times when we need them are also times that are very conducive to forming air pollution. And so this is nitrogen oxides is one of the precursors to ozone, as well as some types of aerosol. We also have natural sources, reactive carbon or volatile organic compounds that are emitted from vegetation and are strongly sensitive to temperature and sunlight. And then I have sort of, you can see the brown is supposed to be soil, and we have microbes in the soil that emit more NOx depending on things like temperature and frequency of precipitation. Of course, we also have wildfires, which are a big deal out, particularly in the western US and the southeast. And it's pretty exciting in atmospheric chemistry right now. There's a field campaign or a set of field campaigns that are happening that should give us a lot more information about how fires affect air quality and climate. Okay, we also have chemistry that itself is sensitive to meteorology, in particular temperature, water vapor, I won't talk so much about it today. And in general, in atmospheric chemistry and air pollution, I think we often overlook thinking about the sink to deposition or uptake by the surface. And that's something that Olivia Clifton has spent many years thinking deeply about. And so I would encourage you to talk to her if you want more information on that aspect, because I won't really touch on it today. Okay, the second part of the talk is going to, like I said, turn things around and focus on how air pollutants affect climate. And so while I'll focus mostly or really exclusively on particulate matter today, for completeness, I include in this slide the gas phase compounds that are strong greenhouse gases. And again, we have this mix of natural and anthropogenic sources that give us reactive carbon species as well as nitrogen oxides that in the presence of sunlight react to form ozone. And ozone is tied to this hydroxyl radical that we'll talk a little bit more about later, but we need water vapor to form OH, which of course is also a strong greenhouse gas. And then on the aerosol side of the slide, we have black carbon here, which is one type of aerosol that is absorbing and therefore can lead to heating of the atmosphere, whereas reflective aerosols like sulfate and at least non-brown organic carbon tend to reflect solar radiation and have a cooling influence on temperature. As many of you know, these aerosols also interact with clouds. They provide cloud condensation nuclei or ice nuclei for water droplets or ice to condense out on. And when you have more of these surfaces available, you can end up having smaller droplets because the same amount of water is available to condense on a larger surface area. And so clouds can last longer and be brighter. And in general, it's thought that precipitation can be suppressed as well. So these are our aerosol radiation and cloud interactions. Okay, and then part three is getting more into thinking about atmospheric oxidation capacity, which is central to chemistry-climate interactions. Our goal here is to understand how OH varies in time and in space, and ideally to develop some observational constraints on the models that are trying to model this variability and all of its implications for atmospheric composition, air pollution, and climate. And OH is the major sink for the reactive greenhouse gas methane. And so we have different sinks for OH as well as sources. And so our goal is not just to understand variability in OH itself, but also the processes that are driving that variability. And because OH is so short-lived, it's typically around for less than a second, it's really impossible to have direct measurements for these constraints, which is why we're seeking these sort of what I'll call proxies for OH variability. Okay. I also wanted to just mention, I am very happy to be interrupted, so I don't know how you typically run your seminars, but if you want to ask questions, feel free to jump in. Okay, so part one, which is thinking about, in this case, we're going to focus largely on particulate matter, but I also wanted to mention surface ozone, which are two top air pollutants in the US and pretty much in most regions of the world. And these often co-occur with heat waves. And what I'm showing you is a map of the eastern US where we see measurements from a network of observing sites across the country. June 26th through June 30th of 2012 was actually a large heat wave that kind of extended into early July of 2012. We have fine particles or particulate matter, or PM 2.5. The 2.5 is 2.5 micrometers. It's particles that have that diameter or smaller. And those are the ones that are thought to be important for health because they're small enough that they can get deep in your lungs. And so we see that the PM patterns tend to follow the ozone spatial patterns as well. You'll also notice that a whole bunch of the sites only measure PM every third day, which is why we have these gaps And on the bottom row, we have sea level pressure and frontal systems depicted. And this is just to try to tie together the patterns, showing that when we have cold fronts come through, we tend to ventilate our boundary layer and clean out our air. And so the point that I use this slide to introduce is that as climate warms, if we expect to have more heat waves, does that automatically mean that we then expect to have more pollution, in the case where we assume, say, that our emissions of air pollutants stay constant? And that's going to be kind of the framework that we work in for this next set of results that I'll show you. So our approach for this project to address these questions of how does climate change affect air pollution in the eastern US is to use empirical orthogonal function analysis. And this is a technique that I think is fairly common in climate science, but the goal of it is to pull out your underlying modes of variability. So what are your most sort of frequent patterns that in this case we're going to think about PM 2.5 vary over. And so what I'm running this EOF analysis on are daily fields of 24-hour average fine particulate matter archived out from a set of chemistry climate model simulations with the GFDL CM3 model. We have 3 ensemble members that we'll use. And I'll go into more details on the specific simulations later. But the overall goal here is to try to identify these regions that vary coherently. So instead of having time series in every single model grid cell that I need to think about in terms of how are these pollution events changing, I can have a few regions that vary cohesively together and then analyze the time series for that region. So it's really a data reduction exercise. And then we can do whatever kind of time series analysis we would like on these principal components, or the time series that tells us how strongly expressed this particular EOF pattern is. So I think everyone's probably familiar with this, but if not, this is the EOF pattern. This is an accompanying time series. These are some results that you'll see in a few slides. And our goal is also hoping that this information is relevant for air quality and potentially even climate management, thinking out a few decades. Okay, so before we launch into the model analysis, we've done some proof of concept where we take the observational record of, in this case, I'm going to show you PM 2.5 over the eastern US and run this analysis on it. And what we expect to get out is that the number of high PM 2.5 events is declining over time. And we know that should happen because we've observed it. There's been several papers on it. And that in turn has been a result of our health-motivated regulations that reduce, in large part, sulfur dioxide, also nitrogen oxides, over the US over the last couple decades. Okay, so again, our approach is to characterize variability and change in these summertime high PM 2.5 events using this EOF analysis. And for the observational data set, what I'm using here is a gridded, interpolated data set that Jordan Schnell, who is now at Northwestern University, he was a graduate student with Michael Prather at UC Irvine, and he basically took the point data and made a 1 degree by 1 degree grid over the US. We're using the eastern US from 1999 to 2013. And this is really ideal for working with a coarse resolution chemistry climate model because the resolution that we're working at is about 2 degrees, latitude by longitude. Okay, so when we run this analysis, this is an example of what we get out. This is our first EOF, or one of our EOF patterns that isolates the northeastern US as a region that varies coherently in terms of PM 2.5 levels. And again, this is from the observations. And this is the accompanying time series from 99 to 20, actually I think this goes out to end of 2013. And so what you see, and we've oriented the principal component such that high time series values corresponds to high PM 2.5 levels. And so what we did is we kind of arbitrarily just draw a line here and count up the number of times that these values go above this line. And what we find is that if we split this time series in the middle at 2007, we find 100 days, over 100 days beforehand, and only 18 days beyond, suggesting that there's been a real reduction in the number of high PM2.5 events, which is what we expected to get out of this, given the large decreases in anthropogenic SO2 emissions. And SO2 is a precursor gas to sulfate aerosol, which is one of the dominant components in the Northeast US for PM2.5. And so this was our proof of concept that our approach can capture this change in these high PM2.5 events from the observational record. And as I said, this isn't, the result itself isn't new. It's been published before that there's been this decline in actually both PM and ozone as well. Okay, so these are the 5 patterns that pop out of the observational analysis. And so we see that now, instead of having all these different model grid cells, I have 5 regions that we're going to focus on for our analysis. So the Northeast, the Midwest, the Mid-Atlantic, East Texas, and the Southeast, which is largely Florida and kind of southern Georgia. And so together, these 5 patterns explain over 75% of the total variance in our PM2.5 observational data set. So then the next question is, okay, how does the model, what about the model? So before we jump into the results, I wanted to just give you a sense of what the actual scenarios are that we're working with in this model. And so what we've done is to take, for those of you that are familiar with the RCPs, the representative concentration pathways from the CMEP5 effort, we're using RCP 8.5 for the well-mixed greenhouse gases, but everything else, like ozone and PM2.5 precursors, we're keeping constant at 2006 levels. Okay, so it's really, we're calling it RCP 8.5 underscore well-mixed greenhouse gases, because only the well-mixed greenhouse gases are changing. In this scenario, by the end of the century, CO2 is increasing almost by 150%. Methane is more than doubling. An important caveat to this is that we don't have any feedbacks in terms of, we don't have wildfires changing because climate is changing. And actually, BVOCs are held constant. We do have, and soil max is held constant. Lightning does respond to meteorology, as does DMS, for those that want the details. And then what you see over here is just what the summertime 2-meter maximum temperature is doing by mid-century as compared to the beginning of the century. And so we see in the Northeast region, for instance, we're getting, actually over Colorado as well, over 2-degree increases in temperature. And by the end of century, those increases are in this deep red, which is over 4 degrees warming. Okay, so the next thing we did is to just take these, the model daily PM2.5 fields, and I should have emphasized that we're only looking at summertime for this study. So we're looking at every summer from 2006 to 2100, and we run this EOF analysis, and we have 3 different ensemble members, which means that everything is the same except the initial conditions are, for GFDL, actually what it means is it's launched from a different location in the control simulation, which are then run through the historical period and then carry on into the RCP 2006 to 2100 timeframe. So we have 3 of these ensemble members that we launched in 2006. And basically, they all show the same patterns that we pull out of the observational data set, with slightly less of the variance explained. One of the things that I'm emphasizing on this slide is just that this kind of statistical analysis is a nice way to evaluate a climate model where you don't expect it to represent this particular observation on this day at this place, but you want it to get the overall kind of variability, in this case, that is observed in the real world. So this is for ensemble member number 1, the Northeast EOF, the time series from 2006 to 2100. So there's a point for every summer day. And obviously, it's quite messy. Somewhat arbitrarily, or entirely arbitrarily, we decided to just draw a line at the upper quartile and think about upper quartile events. And so if you squint, maybe you can kind of make out that there's a little more density at the end of the time series in the upper quartile than at the beginning. But to make that a little bit more obvious, what we did is to actually count for each summer how many events or how many times does that principal component go into the upper quartile. And so we can do that for each of our ensemble members. So what's plotted here is the number of days in the upper quartile per summer. And then this is going from 2006 to 2100. And the different colors are the different ensemble members. And so while admittedly I see more of a kind of, a linear, and then it's kind of step change here. But if we just want to put some numbers easily, simply on it, if we fit a line, then we would conclude that anywhere from 16 to 20 additional days go into the upper quartile by the end of the century as compared to the beginning of the century. So this does suggest an increase in the frequency of high PM events due to climate change by the end of the century. What we were also interested in, though, is not just the frequency, but the duration of events. And it seems like if you're, even just from the heat side of things, which actually we also look at in this project, although I'm not showing you here, if it's a 7-day event versus a 2-day event, it seems like there might be differences in terms of like how the human body responds and health impacts. And that's not something we're actually working on for this project, but that was kind of part of the motivation for thinking about different duration events. And so what we've done here is for each decade, count up the number of upper quartile events, but segregate them into different categories. So each time we go into the upper quartile, does it stay up there for 1 to 2 days, which is shown in blue, 3 to 4 days, shown in red, or does it stay up for 5 or more days, which is shown in green? And then we do this for each of the 3 ensemble members, and what's shown here is the average over all 3. And so what I found pretty interesting is that it looks like if you focus in on the green bar, the longest events, there seems to be this almost doubling, or in some cases maybe even more than doubling, of the number of these long duration high PM 2.5 events by the end of the century. Okay, but some of that could just be because the frequency has increased, that you're more likely to get days next to each other now. And so what we've done to try to separate out like what's a true change in duration from a change in frequency is to kind of change the way we're doing our metrics. And in this next slide, what we do is just every summer look at the top 10% of the events and look at how those change between 2011 and 2040, so beginning of century, versus 2071 to 2100, end of century, and see whether the average length of an event is actually increasing. And so what we're finding is that for the Northeast, which is what we were just focusing on here, we do see a bit of an increase in the average duration of events, but it's not by multiple days. On average, it's maybe less than half a day longer, which suggests that a decent chunk of this increase is in part just because the frequency has increased by the end of the century. We do see in the Mid-Atlantic, however, that we get almost a day increase in the average length of a high pollution event by the end of the century. Okay, so basically the goal of this project was to kind of think about a way that we could diagnose changes in frequency and duration of pollution. We're also working on heat events as well in these chemistry climate models. And what I've shown you today is actually one piece of a larger project. And so where we're headed with this is there's sort of 2 angles. One is to try to build up more of a probabilistic framework by extending from our 3 ensemble member set to something more like a 15 or maybe it's 20 ensemble member set that's available here at NCAR through some simulations that Jean-François Lamarck had run a couple years ago, where they did something similar and they held aerosols constant and ran out over the 21st century. And so that, we think, would give us a broader sense of how these high events are changing, that then we could place our 3 GFDL ensemble members in the context of that larger probability distribution that we could get from a larger ensemble. In addition, we want to try to make the results more relevant to air quality and potentially health applications. And for that, everybody always wants as fine a scale as possible. And so part of our project is taking simulation, sort of picking out different years from our GFDL simulations. And we've been doing sort of rerunning some of those simulations to provide boundary conditions to colleagues at UNC Chapel Hill. This is Jason West's group, who are then running WRF and CMAC to downscale. And part of the exciting part of that project is they will then consider some of these feedbacks that are neglected in the coarse resolution model, thinking about, for instance, secondary organic aerosol and potentially wildfires as well. And so the idea here is then for those fine resolution simulations, since they're sort of based from the GFDL ones, and if we have this broader context of a large ensemble from NCAR, we're trying to bridge scales and get sort of the coverage and statistical power of these coarse resolution models, but also think about how that might change when you go to the finer scales that provide information on the scales that decision makers are much more interested in. Yeah?
What's the resolution?
So they are running, I believe they're doing continental US and it's 12 kilometers. So it's still, I mean, it could still, you know, people, especially for health applications, people always want as fine as possible, but it's much finer than this. Right. Exactly. Exactly. So, good. Yeah, any other questions? Launch into part 2? Okay.
So you have up there also statistical.
Yeah, so basically this was intended to be a broad slide, and there are, you know, certainly you could apply statistical approaches, and quite honestly, I think we have so much data from these projects that if folks have ideas, but for our project, yeah, we're just focusing on the dynamical downscaling.
How much of a mismatch did you see in
That's a great question, and oh, I'm sorry. Okay, I'm going to repeat the question. So Forrest just asked how much of a discrepancy there was between the EOF analysis in the GFDL and the NCAR model, and the sorry answer is we haven't done the analysis on the NCAR model yet. So, but my sense is that I'm not expecting them to look all that different, and this is why, because actually way back in my PhD, I did an EOF analysis of ozone data, and I looked at it on, I'm really dating myself, but it was at that point the MAXIT model, which was the prototype to CMAC, and 2 different resolutions of the GeoSChem model, and they all kind of come out the same. And I think the rationale for that is really that the large-scale episodes are driven by large-scale synoptic meteorology that all of these models are capturing. But if they don't, it will be very interesting, and we'll have to figure out why. Great question. So the question was, do the patterns change when we look at end of century versus now? And it doesn't. And that's why originally I thought we were going to do all this kind of more complicated work, but then everything just looked the same in terms of the patterns. And so in that sense, we didn't worry about that. I mean, I think we've thought a lot about, like, should we be projecting the model onto the observed patterns? And we could do that, and maybe we will eventually do that, but it just hasn't seemed like the most critical aspect, since the patterns pretty much look the same. So, and actually earlier work, so back in the 90s, Brian Eder at EPA had actually also done an EOF analysis on what was at that point a shorter data record for the eastern US. And again, the same patterns kind of come out, so. Okay, any other questions? Yeah? Oh, great idea. Then I don't have to repeat.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about the time series analysis. So you fit the linear trend, but then you said something about how it looked like it might be plateauing. Do you have an idea of what the mechanism is here?
No, okay, so I have ideas. I don't actually know what that is you're talking about here.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I actually would like to connect this back to your previous Thompson lecture speaker, Livy Barnes, had done some work looking at jet shifts in not these exact simulations, but similar ones. And in the Northeast, there was a pretty sort of, well, not just the Northeast, but in the GFDL model, the jet shift in the RCP 8.5 simulations was fairly large. And so I'm kind of wondering if there's sort of a change in that sort of climatological jet location. But that is speculation at this point.
So like a dynamical response and not a response to the forcing in RCP 8.5 itself?
Well, a dynamical, I think it is a response to the forcing in RCP 8.5.
But not a change in the forcing over time, more like the accumulation of the forcing.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah, at least not a linear response. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. Okay. So we'll go to, right, I was just going to mention here, which I think I kind of made the point earlier, but that we are neglecting many feedbacks from the biosphere, including things like dry deposition that may be affecting air pollution going forward. Okay, so switching gears here to think, oh, sure. Yeah?
So you're saying there are very
You're saying there are various feedbacks involving the biosphere that are neglected. Would you expect, just, a thought experiment, that including those feedbacks could substantially change this basic message?
No, I think it might amplify, actually, because I'm thinking wildfires, if there's more fires, that's going to increase PM 2.5. Well, it depends what we think about VOC and whether it's increasing due to temperature or whether CO2 rising is offsetting that. But so if those increase, that might increase secondary organic aerosol. What's gonna moderate this, though, is the decreases that are happening in anthropogenic emissions. So that would actually reduce the sort of levels during these extreme events. And so in that sense, assuming we continue to clean up our air in this country, then actually that would, I don't think that will, I guess what I'm trying to say is I think what we're seeing is driven by the changes in meteorology, but if we have sort of less fuel around from anthropogenic emissions to create high pollution events, then that would be moderated. So, Oh, right, and I guess another feedback, since Olivia's here, I have to mention deposition, that there's been some work over Europe that suggests that during heat waves, as plants start to or heat waves and particularly drought, as plants start to kind of wilt and close their stomata and die, then actually more of that, sorry, this is more an ozone feedback than a PM feedback, but the pollution will stay in the air rather than depositing into or onto the plants. And so that can be a positive feedback, potentially. Yeah, so lots of interesting work that could be followed up on here. Okay, so now we're going to think largely about sulfate aerosol. So we're going to zoom in here and think about sulfate aerosol over the US and how that influences regional and global climate. And actually by regional, I also mean in different regions around the globe. And the motivation here is that, as I had mentioned earlier, SO2 emissions have already declined and are projected to keep declining over the rest of this century. And so this is just a figure showing the SO2 emissions from 1960 out to 2100. And the different colors are the new shared socioeconomic pathway scenarios that are being used in CMIP 6. And then this is a nice picture from space that's looking at SO2, which is the precursor gas to sulfate aerosol. And you can see in 2005 a red spot over the Ohio River Valley and along the kind of east coast. And then by 2017, it's really cleaned up. And so this is, again, a lot of our coal-burning power plants that have either switched over or closed, and to some extent also regulations on fuel. Okay. So the question we're after here is how might these declining US SO2 emissions influence regional and global climate? And here we're going to focus in on one aspect of climate, which is precipitation. And our methods here are to use long control simulations with year 2000 conditions or 2005 in the NCAR model that we've run out for over 400 years. We then, relative to those runs, conduct over 200 years of perturbation simulation. And for what I'm going to focus on today, it's zeroing out US SO2 emissions. We also have, this is again part of a broader project where we're looking at other regions and other aerosol types. And then we also conduct a set of fixed sea surface temperature simulations so that we can quantify the effective radiative forcing that results from zeroing out US SO2 emissions. And so we have 3 global chemistry climate models that we've done this with. And here's the length of the 0 US SO2 simulations and the corresponding effective radiative forcing. One thing to note is the much smaller forcing in the GISS model compared to NCAR and GFDL. It's about a third. And so I'm just going to show you a couple highlights. And this work is led by Dan Westervelt, a research scientist at Lamont. And this is, I'm pulling from a pair of papers. The first is this one in JGR, where Dan found that as US SO2 emissions decline, what we're looking at here is the change in average temperature in summertime in the NCAR model and fall in the GFDL model. And we see this asymmetric warming of the northern hemisphere that since we've removed SO2, which is leading to less sulfate formation. And remember, sulfate is a cooling influence. So when we remove it, it's a relative warming relative to the simulation that has the sulfate in it. And what Dan found is that there's shifts in the precipitation over the Sahel. And the climatological precipitation is shown with these gray contours. And in this case, blue is drier, red is wetter. Okay, and so we see this increase in Sahel precipitation when US SO2 emissions are removed. And it turns out that for those of you that are atmospheric dynamicists or climate scientists, you probably know much better than I all the dynamical reasons behind this shift. But basically, it's been well established that when you have asymmetric warming in one hemisphere, your intertropical convergence zone shifts into that warmer hemisphere. And so what we're seeing here is this shift of the ITCZ northward into the Sahel. And Dan, in his next paper in 2018, actually shows that this is kind of a consistent result across different aerosol perturbations. So it's not unique to US SO2, although US SO2 does induce one of the larger responses. And so the other interesting response that we noted in these simulations is rainfall in the tropical Pacific response. And that's what we're looking at here in the NCAR, GISS, and GFDL models. And so again, red is more precipitation, blue is drying. And there's a little bit of model evaluation here just showing the zonal mean observed precipitation from GPCP and the 3 models on top. And of course, they all suffer from a double ITCZ. But the question we got interested in here is whether these changes in anthropogenic emissions are actually inducing ENSO-like precipitation responses. And so if we're changing rainfall patterns in the tropical Pacific, is this an ENSO kind of thing that's also teleconnecting into other regions? And so to do this, we first had to define an ENSO index in the models. And the one that Dan selected is from Gabe Vecchi's 2006 paper, which is basically based on the longitudinal difference in sea level pressure, so like a measure of that Walker circulation in the equatorial Pacific. And what we're looking at here is a difference in sea level pressure when the US SO2 emissions are removed relative to that control simulation. And so it suggests this shift towards the positive ENSO phase when we remove the US SO2 emissions. And so for the following analysis, what we're doing is defining our ENSO index as that pressure difference between box A and box B. Okay, we do that in the control simulation and in the zero out US SO2 simulation. And so then what we do is we subtract that ENSO index in the control from the perturbation simulation where we've zeroed out the US SO2 emissions. Then we go to the control simulation and ask the question of, okay, if we just take our global precipitation map, where is precipitation in the control simulation correlated with that ENSO index in the control? And that's this R regression slope precipitation to ENSO. And then what we do is we say, okay, this tells us how that ENSO index is changing because we perturbed US SO2 emissions. So let's combine these together and multiply by that regression slope in each model grid cell and get a change in precipitation that we're saying is attributable, at least according to linear regression, to that change in ENSO induced by the US SO2 emissions. With the caveat that we haven't accounted for like how US SO2 emissions might be changing interannual variability in ENSO itself. And so this is what we find. This is just that component that's isolated to the change in the ENSO index when we perturb US or zero out US SO2 emissions. And so it's a little bit washed out, but there seems to be in the models this kind of drying over the Amazon and a little bit over India as well. It's a little bit faded out here, but this model shows it a bit too. Which suggests that there is some of these teleconnected regions are responding. And so we find that the precipitation change in the, like if you take the total difference in precipitation between the control run and the zero out US SO2, that we can explain up to 20% of that due to this change in the ENSO index. And so the reason why I wanted to present this today is really because I think it raises an intriguing question of to what extent do changes in anthropogenic emissions end up projecting onto our natural modes of variability and kind of blur this, what we maybe tend to think about as natural variability versus climate change. And so that's the little summary here. The key takeaways are that we do find that regional aerosol emission changes are inducing remote precipitation responses. And I didn't show you, Andrew Conley here from NCAR has a paper where he was looking at changes in temperature. And I should have mentioned that this project is led by Jean-François Lamarck here at NCAR. And it's been a lot of fun working on this. And quite honestly, when we started looking at the precipitation, I did not expect to find significant signals. And so it was kind of neat to realize that because of large-scale dynamics affecting the whole globe, that there actually are signals in precipitation that emerge from these regional perturbations in aerosol emissions. Okay, so on to, I guess I should ask any questions before we move on?
So here you're looking at the average precipitation impact,
That's right.
but did you look at the frequency of events or duration of events as well?
I'm trying to remember if we did. I don't think we did. What we did look at was changes in the length of the rainy season over the Sahel, and I think it's in Dan's first paper. There's a little bit on that there's a few day in the GFDL model in particular, if I remember correctly. There's a few day extension of the wet season I think it was at the end of the season. But yeah, oh, okay. What Dan is working on now actually does start to address your question, which is thinking about changes in extremes. So using some of these extreme indices that have been sort of developed under, or at least related to CMIP. They've been analyzed for CMIP models. And so we are looking at some of the precipitation extremes. And one of those does include like duration type questions, although I'm not sure that we're focusing on that one, but we're looking at temperature and precipitation.
So I'm wondering what is the motivation to focus only on SO2 climate impact? Because like NOx emission has also been decreasing in the United States, and I'm wondering if you have any estimates of the magnitude of climate impact of different species emission changes.
So actually our original proposal included ozone and methane and aerosols. And actually as part of this project, we are doing SO2, BC, OC. And so, but we had to cut our budget, which we were still glad we were able to do the aerosol part, but we weren't able to do the NOx and the sort of ozone piece that we had originally proposed. So that was something that we very much are interested in. But yeah, I think in some sense, at least in these models, I think we expect stronger responses to sulfate aerosols probably than most of the other. I mean, maybe for right reasons, maybe for wrong reasons, but yeah, I think these are perhaps some of the perturbations that are best able to tease out signals. And the idea here, obviously what we're doing is really idealized, but the idea is that if we can identify these sensitivities, then in a next step, you could sort of take some of these sensitivities and potentially apply them to time-evolving scenarios. And that was actually one of the goals of the projects. Okay, so thinking about atmospheric oxidizing capacity, and in this case, really trying to think about how it varies. I have until noon, or should I wrap up, actually, because we could skip? Go till noon? Okay. Okay, so we're trying to think about variability in OH and how we might be able to actually get some observational or observationally based information on that in space and time. And so the motivation here is that if we look back at the atmospheric chemistry climate model intercomparison study that was kind of from the last IPCC report, we see that models disagree on the sign of the change in OH from pre-industrial to present, except in the northern hemisphere, lowermost troposphere, which is where the anthropogenic perturbations have been the largest. And one thing to keep in mind is that these differences are occurring despite the fact that these models are all being forced with the same anthropogenic emissions, which suggests a few things. One, that some of the way they respond to climate is different. Two, that the way they're handling natural emissions and how those respond to climate is different. And three, that even just the way they take those anthropogenic emissions, put it through their chemical mechanisms and deposition, et cetera, is different. And so this has really raised a lot of questions. But the piece, and so this is one of our motivations for thinking that, well, if we had some way to actually have observational constraints on OH, then we could start saying this model is actually getting this right idea, and really what we want to test is for the right reason. Okay, and so why now? Basically, we are interested in working towards developing what we're thinking of, and this, I want to be sure to acknowledge, this is in collaboration with my co-PI on a current NASA project, Brian Duncan at NASA Goddard Space Flight Center, and we really would like to be able to have this climatology where we say in this region of the atmosphere, OH is most sensitive to variable X, and we ideally can observe X and thus go on and constrain things. And so why now? Because we have satellite products, we have models, and we're pretty excited about this new ATOM data set. This is a field campaign, atmospheric tomography that flew around the world, sampling the remote atmosphere in each season. And they flew south along the mid-Pacific, across the Southern Ocean, and then north along the mid-Atlantic. And the plane was going like this the whole time, apparently. So it's really trying to get a good large sample size that would be useful for evaluating chemistry climate models. And so just to illustrate what I said in words, the idea is, what if we could say that in this region of the atmosphere, NOx controls OH variability. In this region, it's CO. In this region, it's photolysis rates. Or radiation availability. In this region, it's water vapor. This is just an illustration. This is not actually a scientific result. And then we could go on and improve our models and interpret our observations with more confidence. Okay, so one example today from what we're thinking about. I'm going to skip this and just say that we're seeking, one of the proxy that we're going to focus on today was the idea originally generated with Luc Valin, who was a former postdoc of mine who's now at US EPA. But the idea is that formaldehyde, under certain conditions, its variability should reflect variability in OH. And even though it's not the easiest molecule to measure, it's more available than OH, and it's also retrieved from space, actually by something like 6 different satellite instruments, maybe 7 now that TROPOMI is flying. And so our approach is to use these ATOM data sets to explore this particular proxy and eventually try to extend back to constrained models. So this is just an example of the number of 10-second samples per kilometer that was expected along the proposed flight track. And I just want to acknowledge the folks that did the difficult work of actually flying these instruments around the world and collecting the data that then we're so excited about analyzing. So we're using OH from Bill Bruin's group, J values from Sam Hall, and formaldehyde from Tom Hanisko and Glenn Wolfe at NASA Goddard. Okay, so what's the theoretical framework for why formaldehyde should work as a proxy for OH? We're not going to go through all the chemistry, but basically we're saying in the remote atmosphere the main source of formaldehyde is coming from reaction between methane and OH, and the sinks are either formaldehyde reacting with OH or formaldehyde photolyzing. Now, if formaldehyde is both formed and lost with OH, it's not going to vary with OH. It's not going to give us any signal. So the conditions that we need in order for this to work are that we have low enough OH that the primary loss pathway for formaldehyde is occurring through photolysis. And so Luc Valin in some earlier work had suggested that low enough is pretty much happening throughout much of the remote troposphere, but we actually have the observations we need to test that from ATOM. And so that's what this figure is showing, and this is work from my graduate student, Colleen Baublitz, where she's looking at the percentage of the total formaldehyde that's lost through photolysis, and it's pretty much above 50% throughout the atmosphere, in many regions even approaching 80 to 90%. So we think that theoretically this should work. And just to give you one highlight before time runs out, this is the correlation plot for the mid-troposphere showing formaldehyde versus OH. These are in the measurements. And we get about 50% of the variability explained, which quite honestly I was pretty excited about. And then one of the things we're finding is we have to really screen the data really carefully, and we have to look kind of carefully in regions of the atmosphere where water vapor isn't changing too much, and we're also finding correlations with NOx. But this is an example for some of the different, she just bins into 3/4 of a kilometer altitude bins. You'll notice this big mess here. And it turns out she's finding that these are kind of two different populations with different NOx levels, and there's a lot of detail that still needs to be dug into. But given that it's almost noon, I'm going to go ahead and wrap up here. And so our goal with this third project is that we're working with a broader set of ATOM observations, and actually there's some box modeling that's going to go along with this, as well as the chemistry climate models, to try to understand local controls on OH variability, ideally in different atmospheric regions and different times. At this point, we're looking at season by season. And this is ideally a step that takes us towards this larger goal of really understanding what OH is most sensitive to in different regions of the atmosphere. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'm happy to take any other questions.